Hello, my name is Grzegorz Czemiel. I teach at the Department of English at the Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. And today I will be talking to you about art and science and their possible collaboration in the face of climate change. So I thought I'd begin with a poem because my main background is in literary studies and I thought it might be quite fitting. So I've chosen a poem by an Irish writer, Cailin Hughes, who put out this fabulous collection titled Gathering Evidence in 2014. It's got a gorgeous cover that represents a scientist who turns into something completely different. And that should be my leitmotif in this presentation. The poem is titled Atmospheric Physicist versus Poetic Atmosphericist. Here it goes. You send sound signals into the atmosphere and listen for how they return, distorted. You measure turbulence. One of the last things we're willing to say is unsolvable. Deciphering the data and gathering inference is how you stay alive. I send sound signals into the atmosphere and listen for how they return, distorted. I measure turbulence. One of the last things we're willing to say is unsolvable. Gathering the data and deciphering inference is how I stay alive. This poem presents us with a contrast between two ways of engaging the atmosphere, and it presents the perspective of the atmospheric physicist, that is a scientist of course, and a poetic atmosphericist, who is a person of letters, a poet. And the only difference between the two stanzas that I just read is that the scientist is argued to decipher the data and gather inference, whereas the poet is supposed to gather the data and decipher inference. Both of these discourses revolve around turbulence, which is of course fabulously ambiguous, right? Because turbulence can mean both the movement of air and, of course, political upheaval. Now, the important thing for me here is this wonderful symmetry that Cailin Hughes lays down in this poem. There is essentially only a slight difference between the kind of work that scientists do and the poets. And I thought that it's particularly telling that the poet is switching this mode of engaging the topic by saying that she is gathering the data and deciphering inference. Now, inference means, of course, the conclusions that we draw. And so the scientist would be in this position where gathering inference, right, is where their job stops, right? Whereas the poet's task is to is specifically to decipher that inference, which of course means drawing further conclusions and outlining some of the consequences that scientific progress and technological advancement have on the society and of course on the ways in which we understand the world and develop ways of living in it. What Hughes points out here is the necessity of communication, especially the kind of communication that can engage us aesthetically in a way that activates our emotions and makes us involved in the subject matter. One such crucial subject matter that we all face today is naturally climate change and other ecological crises. And what we've seen happening recently is that science finds it very hard to send its message across and reach the general audience with the kinds of implications that we all should be quite wary of. One possible way of looking at this great divide, as it is sometimes called, is to look at the history of modernity and the very concept of modernity. This is something that Bruno Latour does very well in his infamous book, We Have Never Been Modern. In this study, he goes on to argue that, essentially speaking, modernity is a kind of a project that involves strict separation of two spheres. On the one hand, we would have the sphere of facts in themselves, and naturally the sphere would be addressed by science. And on the other hand, we would have people among themselves, and that naturally would be the topic for social sciences and the humanities. Bruno Latour argues that this great divide is actually rooted in some practical issues. First of all, science has always wished not to be burdened with social pressures. That's quite understandable. On the other hand, the arts and the humanities have always been very anxious about science and its reductionist approach, making them seem really not that important and generally second-hand knowledge, if I may use that sort of expression. Latour offers a very intriguing explication of the Great Divide. He says that the modernness or the ambition of the project of modernity is to separate these two spheres, cutting through them, cutting through this Gordian knot with a sword, separating these two areas forever, neatly compartmentalizing these two domains. However, today, we see very clearly that this approach is no longer tenable. As we may infer from what science tells us about climate change, we face issues that combine the sphere of facts in themselves and people among themselves. Latour cleverly argues that this kind of separation was never really possible and that it could have lasted for a century, 2 or 3, but finally we would have stumbled upon some kind of an obstacle that would reveal the inadequacy of the Great Divide. Latour says that even though we strictly separate the world into natural facts and social facts, the two nevertheless mix freely, but they do so under the table. And as Latour says, the more we try to purify both sides of the divide, the more hybrid entities we construct and assemble sort of under the table. In the light of the Great Divide, climate change appears paradoxical. On the one hand, it involves large planetary systems that are definitely of non-human character. Yet, on the other hand, we learn that we humans have an impact on how climate change proceeds, and we have been one of the major factors in this catastrophe. Latour suggests that in order to overcome the Great Divide, we should engage in the task of tying this Gordian knot back again. However, doing that is not easy, and certainly this cannot be done in one single gesture, just like the cutting of it by the moderns. Latour argues that we should be reassembling the bridges between the two in order to restore continuity between those two areas, because we need that very much in order to establish a kind of line of communication between science, which is the source of reliable knowledge, and communication of its findings in forms that people will find resonating with their own perspective. In order to overcome the problem of the Great Divide, Latour suggests we should try to tie this Gordian knot back again. specifically by addressing issues related to both science and art and reconnecting them in a way that would make the knowledge produced by science more understandable and more resonant among the wider public. This certainly does not mean that we should dethrone science or strip it of some of its vital privileges. Rather, the point is to realign sciences and other ways of amassing knowledge and organizing it into a veritable source of information that could both inspire change and make people more engaged with the processes that the humanity is now facing. Isabel Stengers points out very interestingly that science should be confronted with the sciences. And she says science, or writes science, using the capital letter and the singular, whereas the sciences would be in the plural and using a small letter. And both Stengers and Latour go on to argue that what we should engage in is to defend the sciences against science, the one with the capital letter and in the singular. The science in the singular would be mostly associated with dominance and a kind of a way of engaging the world that prioritizes mastery and full control. It is little wonder then that the science, the capitalized science, is historically or has been historically very closely aligned with the state and the capital. Today, as we all painfully experience, science appears to us in the way that is essentially dictated by big capital. Science has thus made a very risky bargain with power and therefore establishes relations of hierarchy, something that is essentially alien to the sciences in the plural, which offer a flatter perspective in which different modes of cognition and different ways of engaging reality can safely coexist side by side and support each other, finding ways to supplement their findings and seek new ways of communicating and conveying the vital issues that people have been revealing about the world. Science, in the singular, has a tendency to monopolize the epistemological field. What it does is it introduces a sense of mastery, and this mastery has translated very badly into all kinds of consequences, beginning with colonization, that of course accompanied new navigational regimes made possible by science, then in the form of Enlightenment instrumental reason, it reaffirmed Eurocentrism, and finally, with the Industrial Revolution and other huge advancements in the 19th century, science in the singular has aligned itself with the capital and with the exploitation of labor. First, human labor, and then, very cleverly, changing that mode of extraction into something else, into the exploitation of fossil fuels, which have replaced human labor in the factories. Today's implications of this are quite vast. We could say that both the sciences in the plural and the humanities, also in the plural, suffer to a great deal from what has emerged as the intense commodification of all knowledge production. This is quite visible in what happens with the academia today, how the publishing industry works, how the circulation of scientific papers is organized, and how the people working at universities and of course elsewhere are subsumed into the capitalist system that extracts value and is only interested in that which can be easily solved. In sciences, and I mean here both the humanities and the natural sciences, we have a clear problem in this respect because we are all expected to make fast discoveries. We are all expected to engage in this fast science. And in a sense, we become addicted to that. We become discovery junkies. Many scholars pursue areas that are characterized by huge specialization because this enables them to hail their findings as a new kind of discovery. The humanities have traditionally had a big problem with that. And certainly this idea that we should make some breakthroughs, right, has been looming large over all the representatives of the academia these days, and of course beyond as well. As a result, deep specialization, the use of jargon, and a very limited audience for what is considered to be scholarly literature have led to a kind of alienation of regular people, of ordinary readers from sciences, both the humanities and natural sciences. Now, this is a pretty bad thing because it means that we don't have a bigger vision of what we're really doing and what kind of direction we're taking in our jobs, especially when they are related to research and gathering evidence. Traditionally, myth and religion have provided us with a bigger picture of reality, but the Enlightenment and its debunking of the two has caused these visions of the world to become obsolete. As I would argue, however, we are in dire need of a bigger vision today because it's the only possible narrative that could integrate various fields of inquiry and lead us to some possible solutions, both in terms of how we address climate change and how we communicate it. The two recent visions of the world, visions that are marked by a totalizing approach, are Global Village, developed by Marshall McLuhan, and the concept of Gaia, as developed by Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock. Now, both of these concepts are now already around 50 years old, and they are really in need of updating, which is of course done by some scholars, but it's not like we have anything new. Since the late 70s, and especially since the 80s, we haven't really seen any other totalizing vision of the world that would regard it or position it as a singular entity. One thing that comes to my mind is Google Earth, of course, but that doesn't seem to be the proper option. The picture of the world that Google Earth offers us seems to be complete and totalizing, and yet it does also reduce our lived experience to simply coordinates that revolve around capital flows and geopolitical coordinates. And this is a quite limiting perspective because it strictly reaffirms the Great Divide by presenting on maps merely that which belongs to the sphere of people among themselves, not in a meaningful relationship with the environment and with the planet as a whole. Another example, apart from Google Earth, that comes to my mind is the famous Earthrise photograph taken in 1968 from space. It shows Earth as this fragile, delicate blue and green ball hanging in the middle of a dark and mysterious cosmos. Now, although this picture is truly breathtaking and is indeed a fabulous achievement in terms of science and engineering, it offers a very dangerous illusion because it suggests that the way that this photograph was taken has nothing to do with Earth itself. It feels like the photograph is completely and objectively distanced from the Earth. Still, there is a very long and obvious material umbilical cord that ties this specific camera and its operator with the planet. And certainly without the planet and without the natural environment that we all share as our commons, this photograph would never have been possible. The Apollonian godly gaze that we can identify in this photograph is not part of the human experience. It certainly testifies to our ability to go into space, which is fantastic, but at the same time, it puts in brackets the complex relationship that we have with the planet. Now, I think that both science and art can fruitfully address this relationship and shape it in a way that could produce good solutions for sustainable life. One thing that I think we need very much today is a kind of a vision of Earth as a whole that would encompass not only the natural world, that means the natural facts in themselves, the things in themselves, but also humans among themselves, and present both sides as hybrid entities that exist on a single plane. Systems theories show us that some of the emergent features of complex systems can be gleaned only when we have a working model that avoids specialization and compartmentalization and rather presents the planet, that is the planetary system, in all its complexity. Certainly, no single science and no single art can do that, but it is rather their combination and their cooperation that may actually facilitate this task. In light of what I just said, it becomes absolutely crucial to deal and engage with not only world analysis, that means deciphering the world and compartmentalizing our knowledge about it, but also world building. We need to have a workable model that can engage our imagination in the effort to produce workable and sustainable ways of living on this planet and sharing it with a plethora of other beings. World building is a category that is sometimes associated with science fiction. Donna Haraway uses this, however, to point that world building can be actually a form of thinking, a way of doing philosophy. And she engages in this play with the acronym SF. And of course, typically we would decipher it as science fiction, but she also says that it can mean science fact or speculative fabulation. She adds to this series of explanations another item that is speculative feminism. And for her, all of these areas need to converge for us to be able to weave together a different story, a different narrative that would encompass both us, the Earth, and other beings that we coexist with here. In this sense, world building can be truly expanded and considered to be a very broad approach that involves both science and storytelling. Because in order to be successful at world building, we have to have a firm basis, like the one that we are offered by science, but on the other hand, there has to be room for free play of imagination. And this free play of imagination is something that deeply engages us and elicits from us an affective response, meaning that we become more engaged and make an emotional investment in the whole thing. World building, understood as Haraway wants to, as a form of engaging both in science, fact, and speculative fabulation, is something that unites both scientists and artists in an effort to cooperate and engage in the vital work of weaving together the various strains of the arts and sciences so that we can come up with a fuller and better image of the Earth as a whole. This image is very necessary if we truly want to start thinking in planetary terms and become planetary citizens who are no longer preoccupied with the Great Divide and enclose themselves in the fortress of culture. To wrap things up, I wanted to go back for a second to the idea that I delineated earlier, the one by Bruno Latour, and specifically his idea that we should engage in the reassembling of Earth bit by bit and issue by issue. Once again, this is not something that can be done from top to bottom. It has to be done from the bottom up. And to illustrate this, I wanted to talk for a second about a work of art or an artistic project developed by Ingo Günther. Ingo Günther began his world processor project in 1988, and it is still ongoing. As part of this artistic and scientific venture, he has been assembling different kinds of globes. Each globe is devoted to a specific issue and covers one particular problem. And stringing them in one long series, he shows how inexhaustible Earth is and how different perspectives can only have a partial access to its mysteries. It is a good demonstration, I would say, of how different approaches can contribute to the development of new coordinates in which we can try to capture the Earth, or at least point to its existence as a single large organic whole. So whether he discusses refugees or the use of cars or questions of unemployment or the location of natural resources, each of his globes addresses one very specific issue and draws our attention to how these issues today have a global reach and how addressing them requires that we think globally. Just as Donna Haraway argues, we need that extra bit of fabulation. We need a lie to tell a bit of truth. And I think that the coming together of sciences and arts on that ground, with that prospect of developing an imagination fit for world building, is something that we need to strive for and something that we need so much these days if we want to see a more sustainable and better future.